So I'm talking to you today about bringing humanity to human rights. And it's something that I grappled with as a lawyer in the US and working here in Azerbaijan for the last almost 2 years that I've been here. And by human rights, I mean the human rights that we normally think of. Human rights are inalienable. Every person is born with them. From the moment you come out, like your blood, like your skin, like the color of your eyes, it's something that's innate in you and that nobody can take away. And there are documents such as the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the US Constitution, the Azerbaijan Constitution, and other constitutions around the world that protect these human rights. And I'm talking about rights such as freedom of opinion and expression and assembly, freedom to have an education, the right to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention, the right to be treated equal in front of the law, and the rights to not be discriminated against. The right to have a fair trial in front of a fair judge with a prosecutor who has followed due process and by a defense attorney who knows what they're doing. And when I think and talk about humanity, I'm really talking about human nature and that which everything that makes up the human condition. So I'm talking about our religion, our opinions, our experiences and our values and our own psychological profile and everything that has happened to us in our lives that we bring to interactions with other people. So as Sarah mentioned, I was a public defender in the United States in Philadelphia, which is one of the largest cities in the US. And I did that work for approximately 6 years. And I often found myself in social settings in Philadelphia when I was doing that work. And I would meet a new person, and inevitably, you would have a conversation saying, hey, what's your name? Where are you from? What do you do? And as soon as I was asked that question, I hesitated, because a lot of times I knew what was coming next. And so I would say, I'm a public defender. I represent people charged with really bad crimes that cannot afford to pay for a lawyer. And a lot of times that was met with enthusiasm and right on, way to go. And sometimes it was met with the following statement: how can you possibly defend those people? And when I was a young lawyer, I would hear that question and I would get so mad. I would feel the blood rise in my face, my freckles start throbbing, my hands start shaking. And I would get all pumped up to respond to this question. And I would start saying to them things about, this is one of the best countries in the world, and we have this great justice system, and we respect people's rights, and we have a great constitution, and we have a great history, and people here believe in fair trials, and they believe that everybody should be treated equal, and I believe in all of these things. And then I would start talking to them about how that our justice system was sometimes the best and sometimes the worst thing that we had to claim. That people of color, that people from poor backgrounds were disproportionately represented in our prisons and in our criminal justice system. And I would cite them statistics about how black men and brown men are disproportionately represented in our prisons or in our criminal justice system. I would cite statistics about poverty and criminal justice and all this type of things to them. And many, many moments later, as my voice rose and as I got very impassioned, I would inevitably stop talking. And they would look at me, not impressed at all by my little speech, and they would say to me, but Michelle, those people are rapists and robbers and arsonists and gun-toting thugs and drug dealers and people that I would never want to meet, and I don't care. And how can you continue to represent those people when you know that 99% of those people are guilty? And at that point, sometimes I'd have a couple more words to say to them, but most often, I would let out an exasperated sigh, tell them they just didn't get it, and turn on my heel and leave. That party, that dinner, or that situation. And what this scenario arose in me was kind of 3 things that I thought about why am I getting so mad and so bothered by this? And I would realize that I was mad because they kept referring to my clients as those people. That was part of the reason, as if criminals, and who in America are disproportionately poor people and people of color, as if those people aren't deserving of the rights for rich and white people, that made me upset. It also made me upset because it was some type of judgment that I perceived it about me and my personality and my personal choices, and how could I, Michelle, be somebody who wanted to defend those people. And it also, for me, raised an issue that I don't often admit, but I'm admitting here today, that when I interacted with my clients, when I worked as a lawyer, as I continued to do things in the legal sphere and working with human rights, that every day I bring my own humanity to my work. And I'm definitely fallible, and I am not perfect. And even though I realize that I am held to certain professional ethics and certain just standards of good human behavior, that I bring my own values and my own judgments and my own prejudices to my work as well. And so when they would attack what I perceived as a personal attack against me, I would get so mad, because I did not wake up one day as a 20-year-old college student and say, I want to go to law school and be a lawyer because I want to make a lot of money. And I did not decide in law school to do public defender work because I could not get another job. In fact, for me, my path to becoming a public defender and a criminal defense attorney in the US was very personal. And it began actually when I was about 12 years old. I had a wonderful teacher who did not believe in giving us tests. And so he set up a mock trial in our classroom when I was 12 years old. In all of the roles people volunteered for except the defense attorney. It was a very basic mock murder trial, and nobody wanted that, responsibility because, we're 12, and who wants to defend a murderer when you're 12, right? So he appointed me as the defense attorney and said, Michelle, you have to do this. You have to do a good job. You can't let your own feelings get in the way. So I interviewed my client, who was 12 and accused of murder. I interviewed my fellow classmates as witnesses, and I did the best I could as a 12-year-old. And then my other fellow classmates were the jury and came back, lo and behold, with a verdict of not guilty. Well, that was pretty much the beginning of it for me. Now my ego was involved a little bit. I was very energetic. I was feeling confident about my abilities. I had found the entire process to be extremely interesting and energizing and motivating. And from there until the time I graduated high school at 17, I took these interests combined with personal experiences I had, and that led me to ultimately want to become a public defender. So as I continued into college and into law school, I continued my studies in international affairs and in the law. So I would take classes that would teach me about constitutional law in the US. I would take classes on international law and international human rights mechanisms. And I had wonderful professors who taught me about the history of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, about how we came to have the current international human rights mechanisms that exist in the world today. But at the same time that I was in law school learning about all this great theoretical stuff and all these great man-made ideas, I was also having experiences in law school that led me to interact with people whose human rights were directly being violated and were or were about to be violated. So for instance, I had two experiences that really helped to shape my view. I participated in a legal clinic through my law school, and I got to actually, as a student, represent young juveniles in Baltimore City in the state of Maryland who were charged with crimes. And I found that in talking to these juveniles and meeting with their parents, in trying to do my part to ensure their human rights, all these lofty goals that I was learning about in school, that as I was interacting with them, that's really where human rights mattered, and that's where it was actually happening in practice. That by myself listening to and respecting them, by getting to understand their story and where they were coming from, and often the things, because they were poor and a lot of times they were people of color, the things that had happened to them, their right to education had been violated. They didn't have often adequate education. Perhaps they had unstable family homes. They had things going on around them, urban blight, buildings falling in decay. They didn't have access to appropriate health care. These type of things were, for me, a very tangible way to look at human rights. I also was able to work as an intern investigator in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., in their public defender's office when I was in law school as well. And there I actually got to go out into the community and investigate cases where my clients were charged with very serious crimes. So I was going out to the communities where they lived. I was meeting their mom at their house. If they were out of custody, I was talking with them on their sofa. I was talking to their witnesses, talking to their neighbors, getting to know the community that they came from, getting to understand what their life had been like to shape their decisions and their choices and lead them to their contact with the criminal justice system. And when I graduated from law school, I was further reaffirmed in my belief that this is what I wanted to do with my life. Part of it was, my own self-interest, if you want to call it that I was interested in being a lawyer that worked in the courtroom. I wanted to cross-examine police officers. I wanted to make these arguments that I love making in front of a judge and get all hyped up and excited and potentially be able to argue some really great legal point that would set my client free and be the epitome of protecting his or her rights. And so I went to Philadelphia, and I was no longer a law student. I was now the lawyer. The buck stopped with me. And I was only at that time about 26 years old. And I found myself going into prisons very often, multiple times during the week to visit my clients, also meeting with them in my office when they were out on bail. And so many of my interactions were pretty regular human interactions, talking to people, explaining to them what the police charges were, getting their side of the story, and talking about what the law said and what their defense might be. But there were also times where I had more than a neutral response or interaction to my clients, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. I remember one example when I had a client who kind of made me judge myself a little bit and kind of check my humanity, is he came into my office and he was charged with filing false reports with the police. Basically, he was charged with there had been an accident where his car hit the side of a highway, the barrier that was there. He called it in and reported that 4 young black males wearing hoodies, hooded sweatshirts, and jeans had carjacked him and robbed him, or not carjacked him, but had attempted to rob him and take his car, and that's what led to the car crash. After the police further investigated, and they later spoke to my client and took a statement from him, they realized that what had happened was that my client, out partying as a college student sometimes does, had drank too much alcohol that night, drove his car, himself drove it into the barrier, was never attempted to be carjacked by any 4 black males, and that had called the police to try to cover it up so that he didn't get arrested for drunk driving and so that his parents didn't take his car away. And as I'm looking through this case and I'm talking to him, it was very difficult for me to not bring some type of judgment to our case, because my instinct was to be very upset that he would, lying, I'm used to, I hear that a lot, but to take it to the level that he took it to and to make up the story that he made up touched a nerve in me that made me upset, quite frankly. But at the same time, I was sitting there and I was aware that he had human rights, right? He had certain rights that he was due. I have professional ethics that I'm bound by as well. And they basically say that it's not my place to judge my client, and I still have to effectively represent them regardless of how I feel about them. And so I had to work through that situation and kind of check my own psychological profile, my own values, my own opinions, and my own experiences to get through that and make sure that my client was represented to the best of my ability. And on the other hand, I've also had some really great experiences with clients who, if any of us were to meet them, we would probably be really scared of them. But I've met some of these really great people, and they're charged with these really horrendous crimes. But when you meet them and they start telling you their story about where they come from, and some of them are very honest, and they'll even tell me, Miss Michelle, yes, I committed this crime, but let me tell you where I'm coming from, and let me tell you why I did what I did. And I understand that I need to be punished for it, but I still want you to fight for me as hard as you can, and I want you to make the prosecutor prove their case, and I want you to argue everything you can to the judge. And if at the end of the day I have to go to jail for 10 to 20 years, then so be it. But I want you to do the best that you can. And those type of clients, and there are so many that I can remember by name right now, but I won't obviously disclose their names, had such an effect on me. And sure, I may not want to, have them snatch my purse in the middle of the night one night, but sitting across from them and recognizing them as a human being and them sharing their story with me and the most personal details that you can imagine about child abuse and sexual abuse and how they felt because they're sitting in front of me and they're 25 years old and they still can't read. and that I'm the only person that ever goes and visits them in the prison. They haven't seen their children in a year or so because their wife is not happy that they're in jail and won't bring the children to them. And so they tell me sometimes their stories, and I take this, and I'm reminded in that moment that not only am I a lawyer fighting for their human rights, but really it's just about a human interaction. And during my time in Philadelphia, and even here in Azerbaijan, I've met so many people, educators, journalists, government officials, prosecutors, police, who fight with these kind of issues every day in talking about and thinking about human rights and their own humanity, for better and for worse. And the thing that has occurred to me while I was thinking about my talk here today is, should we, all of us, should we be bringing our humanity to human rights? As if to ask the question, can we choose to? Can we choose to bring our experiences and our values and our opinions to these type of interactions? Can we choose to leave them home and be completely non-judgmental? Can we choose for it to just be about a document that has human rights listed on it and a government obligation to not violate these rights? Can we leave it at paper? Can we leave it in the classrooms just talking about it? Should we leave it there? Or is human rights in action, when we talk about improving human rights situation around the world, is it really just about you and me sitting over tea, talking about these things, interacting, me sitting in a jail with my clients, getting to know them, just listening to them? Where are these actual human rights in action? Where should they be in action? And so I leave you with that thought today. Thank you very much.